you want to tell us a bit how you've enjoyed your residency at the bread chain house? What was it like reading my book first and then meeting me afterwards? Was it as you expected or not?
Are you gonna say this in the podcast? We're recording already. Okay, cool. Okay, it was definitely like a good experience. It was fun. There was your present, your ghost haunting me before while I arrived, and then when you actually showed up, the ghost, it became an ontology. So it was good, and now we're friends. So that's good. Also,
did my personality in the book match my real life personality?
I will say that the way of writing, it kind of reflects your personality. Yeah. So definitely.
All right. Well, I'm here today in my own apartment with my now good friend, Gianmarco Cristofari. He wrote a book called The Politics of Platformization, which he wrote while studying under Geert Lovink in Amsterdam. Recently got his PhD, and recently Gianmarco has been staying at my place for the past month, where he read my book before he met me, and then when I came back home, he was here waiting for me and cooked me many delicious Italian meals.
Thanks.
Which I'm very grateful for. But so Gianmarco is basically an expert on platforms and the politics of platforms. So we're going to get into that in a bit, but maybe first it would be interesting to know, Gianmarco, if you can introduce to people who you are and maybe a bit of your history, as well as I think what's relevant is kind of like the work that you did in your activism with Extinction Rebellion.
Yeah, so I have a mixed background in the sense that I am a lawyer actually, and I've been active, as a data protection consultant for like 2 years. Then I work in labor law for other 2 years. But beside that, I'm kind of a leftist, and so I've always tried to be kind of politically active in many ways. Yeah, and when I quit my job in 2019, I moved back to my hometown. Then I kind of got involved into Extinction Rebellion and in the organization of the Italian movement until COVID came, and then it was kind of problematic to do that and the PhD at the same time. But that was a very, very interesting experience because, the questions, of our time, basically, my opinion, are, apart from the technological question, the climate crisis is like really like our epistemological horizon. It's like the single most important fact we can care about. So that, and then I moved to Amsterdam, and that's where I kind of continued my research that I was doing from a legal point of view, but digging more into the political problems of platformization.
Yeah. So you wrote this book, The Politics of Platformization, which Geert Lovink actually gifted to me whenever we met for the last Money Lab conference. And I had not realized that you were the author of the book that he gave me until I think maybe after you moved in or started staying at my place. But so in the book, you interview a lot of kind of like leading researchers in the world of platforms. Can I say platform studies?
Sure. That's a growing field that is trying to be institutionalized, let's say. But it was media studies before, but now it has rebranded, let's say, and tried to differentiate itself as platform studies.
But in each interview, you ask each researcher or kind of group of researchers that you're interviewing, what is a platform? So I'm going to return the question to you, it's like in your book, what is a platform, to help people understand what that is, and as well if you can explain maybe also this concept of platformization.
Sure. Yeah, so I ask 2 questions actually. One is what is a platform, which is kind of the ontological question, and the second one is what metaphor would you use to describe a platform? And so the point was basically that, for now, platforms, they've been around for like at least 15 years. But, to describe these like kind of digital entities or digital organizations, several researchers in different fields, for example, infrastructure studies, software studies, political economy, legal studies, they were using different words. And they were kind of referring to the same concept, but some of them they were calling, ecosystem curators. Some of them they were calling platforms. Some of them they were calling they other names. And so the platform really is, for me, kind of this. It started as a metaphor, of course, driven by the corporate world. Like some entities at the beginning of the 2010, they wanted to be seen as platform because of the flatness of the platforms, kind of to avoid responsibility. But then, the term got used more and more, also inside academia. And so, like, scholars have been trying to kind of to re-semanticize, I don't know if you can say this in English, but to give a different meaning to it. And so you have several definitions. Now, the definition I like, that I kind of create, is like a platform. It is a marketplace. It is a market, but within the market, capital M. So we know that in economic theories, markets are kind of complex systems which are fully decentralized, at least, for example, in the sense of Hayek and the Austrian School of Economics. But with platforms, there are markets that are actually infrastructures, right? And this infrastructure is used to lure two groups into its ecosystem. And one group, at least two groups, let's say, because it's a multi-sided market. And one group is, for example, producing services, and the other group is using these services. So let's think about Uber, for example. But, this environment is now a market within a market, in the sense that it is controlled. And the platform itself, as this infrastructure, has an authority to kind of manage the relationship. So it can do things like, curation, moderation, account suspension, and like changing the code behind it so that some action can be enforced, right? So, of course, this makes it very, very problematic for, I would say, the entire Western tradition, that try to limit or regulate the power of companies. Because here we are dealing with companies, if you want, that have acquired infrastructural properties, right? So that makes it problematic. So that was kind of the introductory answer. But if you want to go to the definitions, we can give three definitions. So one is like, from a material point of view, let's say it is an infrastructure, and this infrastructure, it distributes interfaces in the population. This is like, for example, a definition of Bratton. So everybody is holding a smartphone in their hands, and these interfaces, they are kind of the point of contact between the platform as a system of governance and users, right? So it's a way to coordinate people in space and time, and to synchronize, services and people together. And that's kind of the materialistic definition. And then you have the managerial definition, because like platform studies, they actually originate in management, and they say, okay, platforms are infrastructure to produce and extract value. So, I mean, it is pretty obvious in the end. I mean, if you use any platform, value is produced for you, because, I don't know, you can get to a certain point using Google Maps. You can find a new partner on dating apps. So value is produced, but then a part of this value is taken, is extracted. So it's very interesting here how, like, managers, and like Marxist scholar, they kind of agree on the definition of the platform. So, but for one, it's a good new viable business model, and for the other is like a very bad continuation of capitalist extractive practices. And then, like, the definition that I've already mentioned by the Amsterdam scholars is more these reprogrammable digital infrastructures, that use data and that can monetize these data. And and to conclude, the platformization is actually more interesting as a process, right? Because one of the characteristics of platform, let's say, is that they constantly change. They are infrastructure on fire, someone said. They change very fast. And so, even if like dominant platforms as like Google or others, even if they are kind of gonna, they can kind of decline and they can be changed by some other platforms, the organizational form, the organizational model behind it, it's probably still gonna be the same. So this multi-sided infrastructure. And so platformization is I think it's a good concept because it grasps precisely this, right? We have a new organizational form which is gonna stay with us for the next decades, maybe.
Mm. When you say organizational forms, is this specific to like tech VC backed usually platforms? Is that what you have in mind as far as the organizational form or the way and the process of a platform, or not necessarily?
Yeah, that's kind of my PhD thesis, right? It's like by organizational form, I mean an abstract model that you can apply like as a mental schema, if you want. Like you have some dynamics, in societal dynamics, and you can ask yourself, all right, now can I platform that? Can I build a platform to perform that function, right? And that is, as I said, is very abstract, but it's also precisely what kind of cybernetic thinking, which is like the genealogy of digital platforms. It also comes from there, in my opinion. It's what cybernetics is all about, like finding very abstract patterns, right, and then apply them in different situations and trying to see, what's similar, and so I mean, this model is both a new model of governance, and this is kind of all the platform governance discourse, the algorithmic governance discourse, but also a new economic model. And of course, these things are like tightly related because, if before, in let's say in the 20th century, the dichotomy was between planned economic and
Market economy.
Market economy, yeah. Here, platforms, they really blur this distinction, right? Because they are both emergent and planned. And the difference here, of course, is the distribution of interfaces plus software. That's what really makes the difference.
Yeah. I think, for me, I think I like to say that like almost the difference between market and planned economy are not so different as we sometimes think in many ways, that, in many ways, billionaires are the planners of our economy, or can be. But kind of the way that I sometimes think about platforms is also as almost like a form of digital enclosure. You are enclosed inside a digital space. And this relates to kind of like this narrative around Web 1, Web 2, Web 3, where, Web 3, although it is like still, in my view, a lot of it is just like a marketing term, but they try to bring this criticism of Web 2 as being like, walled gardens, and which a lot of it is true. It's just that, there are other criticisms of Web 3. But yeah, can we think of platforms as a kind of digital enclosure? I'm always trying to make like the relation to like the closure of the commons, like in the creation of capitalism in the UK, is like the common story. It's not exactly a parallel, but does that work as a metaphor to you?
Yeah, that's a very interesting topic, I think. The intersection between, like, let's say at the beginning with the Internet 1.0, of course they were already talking about Microsoft, and like versus Linux, and the second enclosure movement. There's a paper on that. And yeah, for sure, you can kind of conceptualize the initial drive to kind of decentralize, when the commercial internet started, with a second phase, which is like basically platform capitalism, right? Which is the Web 2.0, which is characterized by re-centralization. I mean, of course, the platform, it both centralizes and decentralizes at the same time, but in terms of like economic gains, in terms of governance, it's much more centralized. And that's problematic in many, many ways. And then Web 3.0, of course, tries to, again, say, no, now we have a new technology and we have to start again, with the same drive to decentralize. And that's, and that's, in theory, that's very, then I'm not like 100% in favor of full decentralization. I think that platforms, so the point is like, many authors, they're like, okay, platforms are bad per se because they create these enclosures and because they're extractive, and we should not even look at that model, right? But in my opinion, it's too late for that. Let's say that from an evolutionary point of view, platforms are probably here to stay.
Yeah.
And so the question is, how do we create different platforms, right? But I'm not against the use of software, in governance. So how do we create different platforms that they can redistribute value, right? They can, instead of keeping 30% like the app stores, what if we give it back to the ecosystem, right? And that's, of course, a complicated question. I like to think of platforms as something that can be applied at very different levels. So you can make a platform for your own community at a local level, and that can be useful for many different things, like for voting, for deciding the governance structure. Or you can have like huge platforms, I don't know, like WeChat in China. And basically you have your entire life inside those platforms. And the metaphor that I use is like the platform world. It's like a world you inhabit. And I mean, from a socialist perspective, if someone gives me good services, I'm maybe willing to accept that there are like huge platforms that kind of govern my life if I get something back.
Yeah, what was I going to say? To me, when you say that, you said the earlier thing that a platform could be an enclosure in the sense that there's a large company and it's extracting value, but it can also perhaps be used as almost like a definition of the commons that we are kind of perhaps maybe in some ways choosing to envelop ourselves in. It just depends on the governance inside the platform to determine whether or not, it's more like one or the other.
Yeah, while I was researching these, I was asking myself this question, which is like, so if we have like, the definition of the common as this like common resource that has to be managed, then, the platform and the mechanism of governance, it is itself a common, if you want, right?
Yeah.
Because like if you build like a platform, like a software-based infrastructure for managing a common, that is also a common, right? So there's like this relationship in which it weirdly kind of, how do you say, you completely change the situation, and now the platform can be used for managing the common. Yeah.
No, maybe since we're already kind of like getting into that point, I would love to hear from you kind of like maybe a little bit more about the history of platforms as being coming from like the socialist tradition. We've talked a little about, it sounds a bit counterintuitive to a lot of people. When people think about platforms, they think of like tech VC, hyper extractive kind of infrastructures, but instead actually there is a lot of, let's say, platform history in the socialist movement. Could we say that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've kind of divided the genealogy of the platform in two main branches, and one comes from the managerial part, but the other one, it really comes from the attempts of communist and socialist country to provide a better form of planning via computers. So there are two main historical examples, and one is in the Soviet Union in the 60s. It's like after the birth of cybernetics with Wiener and like as a science. That thing was at the beginning banned in the Soviet Union because it was like an American pseudoscience. But
could you maybe define cybernetics briefly for people in case they don't know?
Yeah, impossible to define briefly cybernetics because it's the science of everything and nothing, if you want. But I mean, historically, it has been. I mean, the cybernetic movements. There were a bunch of like interdisciplinary researchers that in the 50s they made the Massey conference, the legendary Massey conferences. And they wanted kind of to find a common language for all sciences. So like physics, psychiatry, biology. And they were kind of talking to each other via metaphors. But then cybernetics, it's also somehow very much related to the military apparatus in a sense. It is also the science of observing systems or of systems that have a goal. There are really, really many definitions.
I think of it just kind of like a universal language for talking about systems abstractly, whether that is biological, whether that is technical, whether that is social, whatever else.
Yeah, sure. I mean, at the beginning, it was very much focused on like the concept of feedbacks, and positive and negative feedbacks, and it was kind of a metaphysical principle of the universe. But then it became a little bit mechanistic, if you want, and then there is a second order cybernetics that turned it upside down, and then it became what I was saying, the science of observing systems. And there are, I mean, cybernetics and system theory, it's applied basically everywhere, right? And in my case, I've studied especially social system theory as developed by German sociologist Niklas Luhmann. Yeah, but to come back to the the socialist genealogy of platforms, we were saying that in the Soviet Union, they wanted to use computer to make political planning more efficient. And in the 60s, there was also the attempt to buy what we can very well call a platform. But in that case, you had like huge computers and they were super expensive. But the idea of the Soviet Union was to kind of place these computers in all the critical cities and then start collecting data about the population so that the population could be controlled better, basically, right? Of course, kind of a dystopian nightmare. But, then this emergent pattern, we can say, they could have been used in the idea of some Soviet cyberneticians to provide like quasi-market stimuli to the Soviet economy. So, of course, like, if you set the price of bread too low or too high, it's kind of a problem. So why don't we use computer to make it this thing much more
Figure
efficient?
out the right price of bread.
For example, now you have something called bread chain for that. but actually, so this is a more dystopian example, but the other one is more famous and it's cybersyn, right?
Yeah.
So it's and cybersyn is also one of the foundational myths of the cyber left. Also nowadays, there's some people that are like, yeah, you've chosen a story in which the good leftists they die as your foundational myth, and that is not very useful.
Right.
But it's really a great story, and I mean, there's also models of podcasts telling it. But the good book is the one from Eden Medina, and there there was this context in which the democratically elected Salvador Allende, the president of Chile, he called Stafford Beer the inventor of management. And Stafford Beer, he was leading this team to build a platform for managing the nationalized economy. And so, of course, they had very rudimental computers and they were slow and everything. But the basic idea is that we connect all the factories, right? And then we kind of see what the appointed official, which are the managers, right, of the factories, what they're doing to the workers. So this could be used as a technology to protect the workers. And in the idea of Stafford Beer, workers could kind of vote anonymously through analogical means how happy they were from like on a scale. And aggregated data about happiness could then be used by the government for making investigations in factories that in which people were unhappy, right? So this is like, I think, a cool example that shows, how you can kind of do this social technical engineering, which is for the people, instead of for profit. Of course, this is a double-edged sword because it presupposes the good government, right? Sure. Otherwise, it's automatically a dystopian. But ultimately, this is like always the case with digital technologies, I think. With you have like, if you have like, when you're inside the platform, everything is already quantified. Everything is already datified. If you take away that dimension, which is both a dimension, of control, for sure, but also a dimension in which you can kind of see the emergent will of the people, right? Mm-hmm. So Stafford Beer used to say that, finally we have a way so that the people can tell the government what they want. And the government can know in real time what people want instead of using like what we still do nowadays, which is like pools for elections and stuff like this. Yeah, so that's kind of interesting, I think. And in terms of planned economy, what we've seen is that huge platforms like Google, they have operationalized this model. Or, I mean, in terms of cyber scene, the perfect example is Amazon. Like Amazon has these logistical omni-nations, and it can see everything that goes on, right?
You've probably read like People's Republic of Walmart, or
yeah, exactly. And that and so the point is that when we think about markets, right, that within the market that can be planned, that is the socialist legacy of platformization, and that is also why many liberals, I'm quoting one over all others because her book is very famous, which is Shoshana Zuboff. They're very angry at platforms because platforms, they can see the invisible hand, right? So they're, like this kind of liberal idea, capitalism is kind of good.
You're not supposed to be able to plan these things, like in a liberal market world. What are you doing? She wrote, what's the book? The Age of Surveillance Capitalism?
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, in that liberal idea, like the state is there for ensuring, that there is a competition, the right competition. And it's like, and now they're like, oh, but this is unfair, because you're controlling the market and you're like fixing prices through algorithms and stuff like that. And of course, that's why kind of the entire political spectrum as a reason to be angry against platforms, if you want. But also for some, I mean, from a more kind of Marxist perspective, they're saying, well, this is literally what has been going on for like centuries, right? Creation of monopolies and stuff like that. So I think that's also something I try to do in the book, like to trace the line of what's new and what's not new with the rise of platforms. It's a very delicate question, I would say.
Yeah. So, I mean, based on your research on platforms, what do you think there is to learn from them by the left? Should we, I mean, I guess you kind of answered this earlier, but like, should we oppose platforms or co-opt platforms, or, how do you see that?
Yeah, that's a big question. Well, let's say that, of course, the situation we are now is basically we have delegated some of the main function, that before they were performed by public infrastructures to private infrastructures that are private digital platforms.
Would you say that the public infrastructures that existed before platforms kind of maybe took over a particular service, they would not be considered a platform?
No, they were not platforms. So, I mean, of course, that all depends on the definition of platform. Like the technological definition is basically super broad, because a supermarket is a platform then, and stuff like this. Yeah, because it has two sides.
You're inside my apartment platform.
Exactly. Yeah, that's why the critic is like, the platform is an empty signifier, if you want. But what was I going to say? What was the question again?
Or whether we should oppose or co-opt platforms.
No. I was saying about the infrastructure kind of thing. What's different is like it's really the historical trajectory, because there's one very good paper that I recommend everyone reading. It's called by Plantin and another group of researchers, and in which they trace, the history of what they call the modern infrastructural ideal. And to summarize it, like we can say that, when things when standards they started to emerge in terms of like, electricity standard for plugging in, or let's say trains, there was like the state, and the state. Oh, fuck. So I start again. So when they were emerging, states were like, okay, we should either nationalize this or turn it in a heavily regulated monopoly, right? And so there were these figures like the system builders, large technical system builders. But with platforms, there are at least two reasons for why this didn't happen. And one is the rise of personal computing, right? Everybody in the 90s from the 90s onwards, they start to use these computers, and the neoliberal momentum, right? All the regulations from the Reagan era, Thatcher era onwards, they were loosened. So these two factors, they led, according to these authors, to decline of the modern infrastructural ideal, and that meaning that now you have these ecosystem builders, right? And these ecosystem builders, they perform a public function, right? But they're a private company driven by profit. And I really think we haven't understand the extent to which this thing is problematic. It is extremely problematic. We are not witnessing yet its full consequences, I think. While, in China, we have seen a different trajectory. They're still infrastructures. They're trying to be somehow controlled by the state. But then, of course, they are sometimes with it, sometimes against it. And again, there's all the problem of surveillance. But we see a different way of achieving what is sometimes called technological sovereignty. But this thing is very complicated, because if you want to put it in internationalist term, that, normally the answers are okay, then we want our technological sovereignty, for example, in Europe, because we don't want Chinese or American interests to get into it. But then we have to become nationalists again sometimes, somehow, right? So it's really complicated.
Maybe then I think it would be interesting to talk a bit about the geopolitics of platforms.
Yeah.
And the regulation. I mean, that's something that you have a lot of experience in the European context. There's the other book that Geert Lovink gave me that I thought was really interesting was it Manufactured in China, Designed in California, and Criticized in Europe. I feel like I thought that was such a good title, and really summed a lot of things up for me, because it seems to me that in the US you have this dominant power and capability of these companies being able to create kind of technology and technological products, also heavily reliant on Asia and China. And then in Europe, there's kind of it doesn't have this huge venture capital tech ecosystem, but it does have the European Union. And it is almost like the gatekeepers of the largest market in the world. So it has certain powers, which it succeeds or not in kind of doing, especially in the context of platforms, which is has been radically and rapidly kind of changing the way we live our lives and contribute to the economy.
Yeah. So I think it's useful to contextualize this at the European level, because the European Union, and I talk about this in the book, has some very specific reason, right, to regulate platforms. And one reason is the lack of political power. We, as a European Union, we are a union which is only half political. We are not completely done with the process of integration, so hopefully we will achieve it. But we use regulation, right, as a political tool so it's also very much about the self-description of European identity, right? So it's we are Europe, we have the most kind of the best social welfare state, and we want to, those are our values. We want to keep on, doing that. And so what we do, we have these platforms that are Chinese, they're American, but, they're not going to act as they want in Europe. We are going to regulate them, right? And this, for me, of course, it's necessary in a sense, but it's very hypocritical, because, again, you end up by doing what I call the institutionalization of digital platforms, which is a Faustian pact, if you want. And on one side, they say, okay, sure, Google, you're allowed to continue to offer your services and extract from European citizens. But on the other side, if you want to continue, you got to kind of follow some of the rules, right? So if you suspend one account, you got to go to an independent body, and then you have to change your internal structure to handle all these cases. And then, you, Amazon, you cannot be at the same time the direct competitor in your marketplace of the people selling some products. So from a geopolitical point of view, the European Union is using regulation as a way, that's my opinion, of course, to force foreign companies to spend more money in the European Union. Or let's say this is the side effect of regulation. Google will now have to hire an entire team of consultants that are very experts about the
GDPR.
for example, that's me, and they have to pay them a lot of money, and this money they will come back to the EU sometimes. But of course, the standards of protection are also higher than in the US.
Yeah.
But in the US, the president can take a decision just by his own that can directly affect the businesses, right? And in Europe, they can't do that, basically.
Right. Yeah, it does. So it's, I mean, if I understand correctly, like you get to be by following, you get to follow the big rules of Europe. You get to join the largest market in the world, but in that process as well, it almost seems to me like it prevents, like the institutionalization almost prevents new platforms from being able to be created or enter into the European market. Where like China has taken an approach where they have like the firewall, and then they have been able to create their own technology platform industry, which I don't know, in my view was probably the right choice to make if you're China from a geopolitical point of view, whether or not you agree or disagree with censorship or whatever else. They're much better off having their own platforms than American ones inside their country when there's such an adversarial relationship. But Europe has kind of like accepted American companies to completely dominate technology in Europe, it seems to me. Like there's not so many, like I can't think off the top of my head too many European like tech platform companies.
Sure. I mean, and that's extremely problematic, no? In terms of
technological sovereignty.
For sure. And I mean, also because like, so 2 points. One, if you now have these institutionalized, very large platforms, then they can provide a lot of services and handle a lot of requests, then it can be more difficult for competitors to de-platform them. You actually they actually say there's a specific word in management I don't remember now. But there is competition between platforms, but it is not as competition between normal companies, if you want. So now the other problem is that as soon as a platform kind of poses a threat, then of course they're gonna buy it. Basically,
yeah,
they're gonna buy it, and it's gonna be part of the ecosystem. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that so now we have seen some kind of European platforms trying to be developed. As for example, there's an Italian one that has received the venture capital from the Silicon Valley. It's called Uno Bravo, and it's for psychology. And so this is kind of where I think we can still act in a sense, because there are some fields that haven't been platformized yet, right? If you think about care, I mean, there are many platforms. Or if you think about like medical services, we don't have one super platform that is managing them all. And in that sense, I really believe that we should provide, let's say, public platforms for that, or at least you want them to be built from the very beginning with a governance structures that includes not only the businesses but also the public sector and like the civil sector, like civil society. So you want them to have a multi-stake governance, and I think it's very reasonable, especially when it is about these topics like health, which are absolutely fundamental. It's like the most fundamental of human rights, right? If you don't have health, you
tell that to America.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I would hope that Europe would do more to perhaps still fit within this framework that it's in of needing to differentiate itself is just more, I don't know, platform cooperatives, more platforms of care, ones that are not VC backed but sustainable, and not perhaps maybe even like necessarily directed by the state in the Chinese way, but I haven't really seen so much of it, but there are people working on it. So I want to get to the crypto part, at least while you're here. For you, what do you think crypto brings to kind of like this problem space of platforms? I know since you've been here, we've been talking a lot about crypto. So I don't know if any of that has like changed your thoughts about it since beforehand or whatever else.
Yeah, no, I'm pretty amazed by the development of the crypto space, let's say, because I was looking into it in 2018. as a consultant, but Ethereum was not there yet, or at least not now. And I was really amazed by how that thing has been developing. So, first of all, I see a continuation between platformization and, the blockchain space, in a sense.
Yeah.
That's for two reasons. One, many blockchain services, they self-describe as platforms. And that makes sense, right? Because it's this common denominator to describe like this governance power that you acquire through software from a centralized standpoint. And that's one reason. And the second reason is it's because their business model, it is about connecting different groups, right? And in one single space. But then there are also like some differences because, the properties of the blockchain, for example, public by default and, potentially decentralized, they allow for building different platforms in which are, the governance structure, it can be kind of personalized if you want. You can use a blockchain, layer 1, and then you can build your own governance structure on it, and that's really cool. And also the ownership structure, you can decide how it is, and that is like a build your own platform kind of thing. It's something
everyone gets a platform.
Sure, every man his own platform, right? And no, that's kind of interesting. So I think the intersection between platformization and the blockchain space, it can be very generative, even if you were and other people are describing it as protocolization rather than platformization, because you want to underline the fact that it's decentralized. But then it's about we should understand ourselves in terms of which words we're using. Maybe we mean the same thing.
Yeah. No, it's, one of the things that has been interesting is that, like you said earlier, everyone across the political spectrum can hate platforms from whatever point of view you took it. And yeah, crypto comes from a kind of like pretty libertarian place. A lot of software engineers, tech people, who did have a criticism about platforms to a large extent. And especially, they were, let's say, maybe they were turned off. I'm thinking in the mind of a libertarian, like they were turned off by the socialism of platforms in many ways, like their association of just like surveillance with communist states, even though like America is probably doing just as much surveillance, if not more. So it is interesting that it doesn't matter what political spectrum you came from, but they at least produced something different, and there is now an infrastructure for it. It's certainly not perfect, and it's certainly not the answer to everything, but it has like opened up the space in a way that I think, I don't know, that the left is just behind on, is what I find. And so like the discourse that I often have, like I was recently on a podcast for a friend of mine who's a left-wing content creator, and it was recently published. And still today, you get comment after comment after comment of, online left people being, I don't know, just like completely wrong information about crypto, and it's hard to like debunk every single one of them every time, or like in the comments or whatever. But no, but it is interesting to hear you say that.
No, but I think also, that somehow the crypto world has to come to terms with the fact that if it wants to be also institutionalized, in the long term. Of course, you can kind of stay outside of the state. You want to stay outside of institutions, and for many people, this is kind of exactly the point, right. Of crypto. But then, if we want to think about blockchain technologies as being embedded, in existing institutions to make them better, if you want, or to make or to change their governance structure. I think that's also very interesting, no? And so that's what you use in your book as the shift from like the monetary/financial function of like metaphor of crypto to the one of more economic coordination, right? And I think that is very interesting. And so, but coming to terms with that, it means also kind of to forget about the very libertarian origin of the blockchain, right?
Sure, yeah.
So you have to. So, for example, I was kind of amazed by the code and law debate,
right.
and how it has entered the crypto world. because that is a very famous debate for like scholars of law and technology. And Lessing was talking about it, and then it developed. But I mean, no lawyer would ever think that code by itself can, do everything and can govern any kind of system by itself. So yes, code is absolutely not law. And we can very well acknowledge that code has brought many, many new, has completely changed the way governance is achieved nowadays. And at the same time saying that it's not all about it, because you will need like a legal infrastructure behind it. You will need governance, which is human governance, and you will need dispute resolution mechanisms, and that you just don't do that through a smart contract.
Not yet. But yeah, no, this is actually this is a topic that was the focus for my book course last night on code is law. And that was, the thing that kind of everybody came to the conclusion to was that, you just can't, with code, it can be useful in a lot of different ways, but it cannot be to think that it's going to substitute. We're just going to, forget all the centuries of thinking and philosophy around law and like just turn it into code is kind of like a silly notion to begin with.
Yeah. But on the other hand, we were discussing this the other day. I find interesting, how code and how software, how it is tied to a certain kind of Platonic vision of trying to build the perfect governable city, right? What they call Calib, the beautiful city, in which, the governors are chosen with sortition, right? And between like the population, like the people that can be elected, right, can be sortitioned. And of course, with software, you can very well do that, right? And software, it's very, very good at creating categories of the world, and subcategories, and then putting an if-then. But and so it's, I mean, I see a continuity between some kind of very anti-democratic ideas and the possibility to build these systems through software.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's a double-edged sword, like I said. But no, I think it was interesting just because I think the context is interesting, because you're saying that when we were speaking the other day that this idea of sortition and citizens' assembly is a big part of Extinction Rebellion.
Yeah,
exactly. But in that context, it was completely kind of manual, I guess, how people were kind of doing these citizen assemblies and this sortition. And so we were kind of like talking about like why this is something that can be mechanized in some way through digital means, either mechanized in the sense of doing sortition or rethinking the entire problem, which was like, I think you told me that like sortition was meant to be something of like, you get a representation of the populace, and then they make a decision, and that would represent the populace because they are representative of them. But instead, with digital technologies, we can also just completely forget that idea and just get input from everybody, if we want to.
Yeah. The problem with sortition is that you have to choose which people can be sortitioned, right? And then you need somehow a perfect representation of all the divisions, of class, race in the population. That is very problematic in a sense, in many senses actually. But that also is something that can be optimized through software, like very easily, I will say. So yeah, there are interesting intersections between like the political reivindications of radical ecological movements. In the Extinction Rebellion, for example, is proposing to go beyond politics that brought us here, stuck with the climate collapse, by, declaring citizens' assemblies, and in which, some sortition people, they are deciding on what to do about the climate crisis based on some briefing made by experts, made by scientists, right? So you have scientists and you have like the jury of the people choosing. And and so you want to use sortition, which on the other hand is a way, to avoid responsibility. In fact, sortition is normally used in the legal system. Like when you have, the jury in the criminal procedures and stuff like that, and not in the political system. Because if you're sortition, guess what? You're not responsible for your actions.
Right.
So it's like,
so if we did like a sortition of like senators in the government or something like that, or like is that kind of what you're referring to?
yeah,
the law?
exactly. Then you're not, you don't have to say I will do this, and then the people, they actually see that you haven't fulfilled, the promises, and that you have responsibility. Okay, I was sortition, It's like, so
Yeah.
it's just like a way in which politics renounces, to its function. But on the other hand, we have seen that this kind of politics is not working. And so maybe to use sortition could actually be a way to do something, to take some action, right? And again, it's a very problematic and complicated topic, but the intersection between the climate crisis and software or blockchain comes back in many senses. For example, when we talk about, regenerative finance, in a sense, right?
Yeah, sure. I thought you were going to say something else.
I'm not gonna get into that. I just quoted.
Smart.
I just quoted. I know it.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, we're about a bit over an hour.
Okay.
Is there anything else that you wanted to mention in this interview?
Yeah, no, I mentioned the part in which we say, like, what can we do about platforms? Maybe I haven't really answered your question. If you stay inside platforms. So maybe I can, because I was talking about something else. Maybe I can talk about that.
Sure.
Yeah, maybe we could talk about the future of platformization or something.
Sure. What had
like no, like, I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, yeah, actually, yes. I'm curious to hear from you. How do you see the future of platformization? I mean, perhaps even with this now kind of like a curveball added into the mix of blockchain and crypto, because I can also imagine that, and we already see this, especially Reddit is one example of this, but platforms using crypto as part of their platformization in some capacity by creating, their own point systems, their own coins, their own tokens and such, is a part of the equation. And then the other part of the equation is like also the existence of alternatives at the same time to some degree.
Yeah. I mean, in the very logic of platform competition imposes this like race in which you want to swallow everything, and include the new technology embedded into your ecosystem before the others.
That's why we've seen like AI get rapidly adopted by like every platform, it seems.
Exactly. And also they want to kind of continuously make new bets about the technology that will be implemented. And eventually, if they get it right, they take the place of the platform before, So that's for sure happening. And again, I see this as kind of this institutionalization of the crypto world, right? Because once they enter the highly platform world, and once you allow like normie users, to exchange crypto inside platforms, that that is also being institutionalized and normalized in a sense. So this is for sure. But then I really think there's a lot of space, and I mean platforms they have been around for like, big platforms, let's say big tech, for like, let's say since Google came.
30 years. Like 20, 30 years.
Yeah. And so there's much space. I think we would need, exceptional intervention. I'm not saying like China, but I'm not okay with living with public infrastrucures in the end of private companies. I'm not okay with that.
Sure.
And I think like the European Union should, like, really, it's about what you guys in the US say, national security, that allows you to do whatever you want. It's about that. But on the other hand, there is this need to experiment with these governance structures from a bottom up perspective. So there's also need to finance, because if you don't have venture capital, you want to have public money, you want to have crowdfunding of some sort, and you want to build these things. And then, of course, with all the contradictions, because the modern world is so entangled that even these distinctions that we're making between the US and China and Europe, they blur when you go to practical stuff, because there are, I don't know, like sovereignty funds that they have invested in that, right? And a lot of the production, it is made for the US, and then the services provided for the US, they are for European citizens. So it's really complicated, but I think we need to experiment more.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Gianmarco, for coming and summarizing all the conversations that we've been having like the past couple of weeks. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you being at my house.
Thank you for hosting me. I hope you enjoyed the Italian cuisine.
Definitely.